It's my pleasure to introduce one of my colleagues, Ron Messerich, to speak to us today. Ron's a member of the Department of Philosophy and Religion at EKU, and he sort of was a mentor to me, just talking in the hall, and I think we spent a lot of time talking about various things I was working on over the years, and it was nice to have a philosophical interlocutor a couple doors down. So Ron's going to talk to us today about human dignity, which is something I know he's been reading and thinking a lot about for many, many years now. So I'm excited to hear what conclusions he's come to so far. So, Ron.
All right. Can you all hear me then? All right, well, good. Just a couple of things before I start. First of all, I was reminded today, talking about people giving food, that I was here, I don't know, what was it now, 12 years ago, a few months after I had a heart attack, and I had occasion to thank this congregation for arranging and delivering meals to me for about 2 weeks as I was recuperating from my heart surgery. And to this day, I remember that with great fondness and appreciation. So some of those people are still here, and thank you again very much for that. I can't tell you how much it means to me to be here on Bob Dylan Day. Matt mentioned that I'm interested in human dignity, but that's all part of a more general interest in the notion of human happiness. And if you tell people you're studying human happiness, they always want advice. Well, what do I need to be happy? And so first of all, I would always tell people, well, I think worry about friendship and love and things like that, and hope for good health and other things like that. And then, and if you want some very specific things, I said I think there are three things that I find indispensable beyond the important things. And those three things are baseball, really long novels, and the songs of Bob Dylan. I mean, I've been telling people that for years. That's how much that means to me. So, and I put a timer on myself to end this, and the signal will be a Bob Dylan song too. So I get to so I have to go that long. Right? So you get to All right. So I want to talk about human dignity, and I have been thinking about it for a long time, and I got the beginnings of what I think are something that you might call a theory. So this is kind of a new original work, and I'll try to be as clear as I can possibly be about it. Back in 1947, United Nations issued its Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it began with the statement, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Now, it's pretty well known that the word dignity got into the United Nations work on this because they needed to say something about what is the foundation in human nature for our human rights. And they could not agree on it. And that's not surprising. People have different reasons for thinking we have human rights. And so they just introduced the term human dignity to be a placeholder, meaning whatever it is. We don't know what it is. And of course, that just leaves a problem then to try to figure out about exactly what it is that is the foundation for human dignity. And over time, it became more crucial because people started using human dignity more in legal circles as a basis for appeals, as a basis for pleas for justice. One fairly famous example among legal theorists who think about dignity is a case concerning dwarf tossing, which some of you may know is an activity that usually drunken people participate in at bars. Tall people throw short people, and they pay the short people for the privilege of throwing them. Well, hang on. It's going to, this is just a start. And in France, it started. The similar cases arose in Canada and I think in Florida, but the first case was in France, that the community ruled that dwarf tossing was an insult to human dignity. It was demeaning, and they outlawed it. Well, what happened is one of the short people appealed that on the grounds that this was his livelihood and that part of human dignity and concerns the right to have a job. And so in the court, both sides were twisting the term human dignity to suit their cases. And in part that was because there was no clear meaning given to the term dignity in legal circles. And it became something that more conservative people interpreted one way, more liberal people interpreted it another way. And as very often happens in legal circles and in philosophic circles, when you see something like that, and you are having a great deal of trouble trying to say exactly what it is that they're debating about, that is, what is dignity, you give up and argue that, dignity really is a vague, and is really an empty term. It has no meaning of its own. And that became an interesting position. There are many people nowadays who say dignity is just a way of saying humans have rights. And if you do that, then you can't make dignity the foundation of rights because you've just made rights the foundation of dignity. So that's when I got into thinking about it. I don't like that idea. It seems to me that dignity is an important concept in its own right. And so I asked myself, can I identify some things about dignity that are not the same as things about human rights? And I've been looking at two. One I'm going to call moral motivation. There's a recent book by Kwame Anthony Appiah. It's called The Honor Code. I've taught that in a number of classes. Matt has written a review of it in a journal. We both respect the book. And in the book, Professor Appiah argues that honor, and with it the associated notions of like pride and shame, are great moral motivators. It's a wonderful book. I recommend it highly. It's very historical. He argues that an appeal to their sense of honor led the Chinese in 20 years to go from a society that were like 90% of the female children had their feet bound to 20 years later, from 90% having them bound to only 10% having them bound in like 20 years, just like that. And the appeal was mainly to the concept of honor. And so it's a very powerful human motivator. And I think dignity is similar to that. I think you can appeal to people's sense of their own dignity to get them to do what's right. Or as Bertie Wooster once said when he wanted to go confront one of his friends who he thought wasn't doing the right things, he said, I got to go over there and slip a jack under his better nature. Well, human dignity is one of those jacks. You can use it that way. It's a motivator. But appealing to rights isn't. If somebody doesn't use their right of free speech, they're shy, don't talk a lot, nobody can appeal to that. You're not using your right, shame on you. There's no shame involved with that, right? So rights don't have that kind of motivation to it, but dignity does. And I think that's worth paying some attention to. Now, the other one has to do with what we might call minor moral matters. Roughly speaking, in the area of minor insults and deliberately cause embarrassment to people. It seems to me that these things are not protected by our human rights. If somebody insults me, they're not violating my rights. If someone causes me some embarrassment, they're not violating my rights. But I do think, in a very small way, they're undermining my dignity. And so I think they have value in their own. Now, I don't have time today to talk about both of them. I want to talk about insult and embarrassment because I've been thinking about that a lot, and I think it leads to some, I hope, are interesting conclusions. I guess I'm not supposed to be political today, but let me take as an example the refusal to shake hands with somebody. I don't know if that ever happens in this world, but they tell me that it's possible that our president turned down the opportunity or pretended he didn't notice the Chancellor of Germany offering a handshake to him. And that I think you can insult a person's dignity by refusing to shake hands with them. Now, sometimes there might be a reason for it, but if you just refuse a handshake for no reason at all, I think that's pretty insulting and is addressed to their dignity. Now, if you want more examples, well, you might think about ridiculing people's physical appearance or calling a person by a certain derogatory name every time you mention her name, Crooked Hillary or something like that. And you can just add more once you think about the behavior of our current president. So I think those kind of insults, again, I don't think we're protected by human rights on those things, but I think those are wrong in various ways. And then there's embarrassment. I got to tell you that I really hate embarrassment. And I don't mean just I don't like being embarrassed. Who doesn't like being embarrassed? I can't even watch it on TV. You know, literally, I fast forward through part of a show if somebody's being embarrassed. I just can't watch it. So I may be a little biased about this, but it does seem to me that a person who likes to do embarrassment humor and things like that is in small ways oftentimes slighting our dignity. That seems to me to be right. I mean, we all learn to be good sports, right? You know, somebody embarrasses us, we laugh it off, and and that's important too. But deep down, we've probably been hurt, and we probably feel insulted in some way. So I think again, I don't think we have a right not to be embarrassed. I have heard of one place where that was a legal right, apparently. Now, take this with some caution, because I tried to find the source where I learned this, and I couldn't find it. I don't think I made it up. It's not fake news. But I had read, I believe, that in ancient Sparta, they had a law against embarrassing Spartan citizens. Now, you might think of why that's true, given that the Spartans were such, were full-time warriors. Embarrassing them might lead to violence and bloodshed very quickly. So you might insist upon a very dignified kind of behavior to each other there. But usually, embarrassment is not covered by rights. So again, I do think it's covered by dignity in general, okay? So those are some cases. I think you make a pretty good case that those things are minor affronts to human dignity in many cases. But why? That's the more interesting question, it seems to me. And I think I've found recently a key to explaining why such things as insults and embarrassment are an affront to human dignity. And I found it in a place that really wasn't related to my research. I was watching or rewatching Ken Burns' documentary series on jazz. And in one of the early episodes, the various jazz musicians that he had interviewed, plus jazz historians, were talking about what was attractive about jazz. And every one of them said, among other things, that jazz is welcoming. And I found that a very interesting thing to say. All are welcome to enjoy it, they were saying. It's a celebration of the beauty of sound that everyone can participate in. And because it's improvisational, new ideas could always be incorporated. So they're always open to it. And they're always willing to adjust for new ideas as the people who bring their ideas are willing to adjust to them. And that struck me as a very interesting and, well, quite attractive idea. I was reminded when I started thinking about it of Salman Rushdie, who in one of his works at great length praises what he calls mongrelization. He says, I love the mongrel. I celebrate the mongrel, meaning people who have mixed various cultures together and have created something out of all that. We shouldn't be purists about things like that. And I think the jazz says we shouldn't be purists about our music. We should be open to changing it because it changes again, builds something beautiful and something worth celebrating. And it occurred to me that this idea of welcoming that they're using in jazz is also something we can talk about when it comes to human lives and the way we relate to each other. And as I was checking today to make sure, today, this morning, to make sure I had the time right for when your service began, I was looking at your web page, and I noticed that one of the items on your web page is welcoming community. And I think that that notion of welcoming that you're using there is exactly this one that I'm talking about here today, about human life. So if I hadn't got it from jazz, I probably would have got it from your web page. So to start to try to explain it, I would draw on Aristotle, where he tells us that we are all social beings. And what he means by that, most prominently, is that we only thrive, we only achieve true happiness. We only really, have success at human life in the company of others, with others. Now, if we start at that as showing what is a basic truth about human beings, then we have to think of ourselves as, if we want to think of ourselves as having a good life, we have to think of ourselves as interacting with and being related to other people. What does it take to do that? What does it take to be a kind of person who can really is prepared and well prepared to interact with others in the pursuit of good lives for everybody? Well, consider a couple things that are not strong enough. Tolerance. Certainly tolerance is a really good thing. But tolerance allows us still to keep everybody else at quite a distance from ourselves. We might appreciate what they're doing, but there's no suggestion that we should be particularly welcoming to others into our lives. So tolerance is not what I'm looking for here. No, nor are human rights. You can respect a person's rights at a distance. You don't have to get intimately involved with people if you're going to have, to be respecting human rights. Now, again, these are generalizations. There are probably specific situations that can arise where rights may put heavier demands on you. But in general, rights do not encourage us to have to cultivate a particular attitude of connection to others, or close connections with others. So I find that neither one of those are good enough. If the kind of attitude we need to have towards each other if we are social beings. I don't think there's a name for this, so I'm just calling it a welcoming attitude. I think we have to be people who are willing to welcome others, even strangers, and give, show them by our attitudes, by our ways of doing things, that we're willing to work with them and them with us and live together, as Aristotle said, in the pursuit of a good life. And that's an attitude thing. That's an attitude, having the right kind of attitude towards other people is involved here. I'm struggling for metaphors for what I mean here, okay? I had a baseball one yesterday, but I decided this morning that it wasn't good enough because it sort of implied that we were competing with each other for happiness. Teams, if you have a baseball game, you got another baseball team out there that you're trying to beat. Well, that's not the attitude we're talking about here. So let's try mountain climbing teams. A team that's trying to climb Everest or some other great mountain, they have to work closely together. And even if you're not a member of a particular team, you might see them at a distance, and you can appreciate what they're doing. You can understand how they're cooperating and working closely together, and you have that appreciation. And then you're doing your climbing over here with your team, and their team is over there doing theirs. But you appreciate what they're doing from your own case. You know how hard it is for you. You understand how hard it is for them. And you can develop tolerance, appreciation of others, and a respect for what they're doing, but you're not seeing them as closely connected with you. So maybe we should try the other extreme, saying we should think of everybody as welcoming them to our mountain climbing team. Well, that's too close. Aristotle, one of my favorite criticisms of Aristotle against Plato, had to do with Plato's use in the Republic of the idea of a city as being like a family. And Aristotle said, no, that's too close. States are more loosely organized than that. And if you put everybody on your team climbing the mountain, then you're saying your happiness depends upon the happiness of all others, and theirs depends upon the happiness of you. And that's that's just false. So what you need is a metaphor that says, as you're climbing the mountain with your team, you might find other teams there, and for a while you might work together. Become one team, to get up this one particularly slippery wall or something like that. And then you go back and you divide again, but you're always welcoming to the others when the situation calls for it. And you have an attitude of, working with others, dealing with others. I think that's the kind of thing I'm trying to get an idea of here. So it's a sort of a partially being on the same team, right? That an attitude of saying, I'm open to that, I'm willing to do that. Well, that's the idea I'm trying to work for. I got another way of going into it, and I'm going to do that in a moment. So, but we shouldn't. I hope you can see at this point that if you're cultivating a welcoming, love mine is zero. One of my favorites. Okay. Yeah, I'm almost done anyway. That insults and embarrassment do not convey the welcoming attitude I'm talking about here. Another way of looking at this attitude has to do with something that has concerned me for a long time. Terrorist groups have oftentimes said that they think democracies are soft. All that freedom stuff, they don't have an ideal, they don't have a commitment, and so they're soft and they're easily defeated. This is an idea that goes way back to the 19th century. Nietzsche said things like that about democracy, and many other critics of democracy in the 19th century said the same kind of thing. But I think all of them miss something about democracy. If you think of democracy in the sense of what kind of attitude do you have to have, what's a democratic attitude? Remember, at the heart of democracy is the idea where you really believe that other people, there are many good ways of living. You don't have to read that every way of life is a good way of life. But a truly democratic person believes that there are multiple good ways of living, and you're willing to accept that. But if you really think through what it takes to be accepting of others in that way, it's hard. It's very hard. Think of free speech. If you're really committed to free speech and it's in your attitude, you're saying, I'm quite willing to have the next person who stands up just stand there in the top of his voice, criticize everything I believe in. And I'm going to say that's okay for him to do it. Then I might take the stand after him, but I'm going to say I approve of his doing that. You have to be willing to work with people in a very close way, in your jobs or whatever. Live next door to people who have attitudes very different than yours. You may be a devout Christian, they may be an atheist, but you have to be, to a certain degree, welcoming of them for democracy to work. And you have to be willing to work with them. And maybe even, to use the old example, maybe you even have to be willing to have your children marry them. All right? And the like. I mean, in other words, you need an attitude that's very hard to cultivate. And I think that's where human dignity comes in. Our human dignity lies I want to say, lies both in our respect for other people, being welcoming to them in the diverse ways they live, and being willing to work with them to create even more beautiful ways of living, and also being proud of the fact in ourselves that we are like that we can be welcoming, that we can cultivate that attitude. I think that's where our dignity lies. And that makes dignity something to shoot for, not something that we have automatically. We have the potential for it, but getting there is an achievement, and that's where the motivation lies. And that's the other point that I said I wasn't going to talk about today. And so that's my thoughts on dignity as of right now. And I'm very interested in hearing what you all have to say about it. Whoa!